Brian De Palma.
Brian De Palma's
A Brian De Palma film.
Hello and welcome. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than we've done on previous episodes. This is going to be more of a full-fledged interview, and I'm very excited about it because I love these types of shows. And I'm here with author David Konow. David, welcome.
Yes, and you pronounced it correctly. How are you?
Excellent. No, I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, I'm always super aware of how to pronounce people's names, to a fault sometimes, I guess. So this is great, David. I know when I was starting to put this show together, our mutual friend DX had said, hey, you should reach out to David. He'd be a perfect person to talk to for this show.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, DX is great, and he's done a lot of cool books and everything. We've been friends for quite some time, and I'm trying to recall how much him and I have discussed De Palma, but I've been a big fan of his actually since I was a kid, practically. I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute, but
yeah. Excellent. And we're going to save some time for the end of the discussion to talk about your books. But yeah, so do you want to sort of give me a little bit of your De Palma history? It sounds like if you discovered him when you were a kid, you've been, on the De Palma train for a while.
Yes. Well, when my family moved to California, we had the Z Channel, the late, great Z Channel. And I remembered seeing bits and flashes of Obsession and The Fury on the Z Channel. And even though I didn't see the movies all the way through and saw a lot of weird stuff out of context, I found a lot of it to be really fascinating. And I guess it's one of those film buff kind of things where, you see a movie you really like, and it's like, oh, what else has this person done? I don't think it was like that with me with De Palma as much. I guess a big moment for me was not just seeing Scarface on cable and being a huge fan of it ever since, probably about a year or so after it came out in theaters, but seeing Carrie with a friend of mine when I was oh God, I'm 12 or 13 or something like that when we rented it, and we didn't see that ending. It's fun to watch the reaction videos. That gets them every time on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. And you mentioned how, sometimes you'll see a film by a filmmaker and it will draw you to watch some of their other films. And the interesting thing about De Palma is you mentioned Obsession and The Fury. And those are two movies where if you watched Obsession and said, hey, I want to see what else this De Palma guy's about, and then, rented Body Double or Scarface or The Untouchables, you'd be like, wow, this is a little bit different than I was expecting.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I worked for a magazine called Creative Screenwriting, I actually had the chance to interview Brian De Palma, and
oh wow,
that was really cool. And what was one thing he mentioned about that was that as far as doing The Untouchables or Mission Impossible, he said, I have a style that I can go in and out of the mainstream. I have a style that works in the mainstream, but I can do my work as well. So he was able to find a way that he could still bring his style, technique, artistic vision, whatever you want to call it, to, more mainstream films again, like The Untouchables or, there's still a lot of Brian De Palma in The Untouchables. It's a fairly bloody, violent movie.
Oh, absolutely. And you get a lot of his techniques. You get the split diopter, you get a lot of the really, sort of advanced camera techniques and things like that. And I would even say that for Mission Impossible, David, if you go and watch Mission Impossible, it's a very, very, it's very clearly a De Palma movie in the way it looks and also in the sort of the way the story's executed.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen The Untouchables in a bit or Mission Impossible in a bit. I saw it when it came out, but yeah, absolutely. And there's also the homage because he has the homage to the Odessa steps in The Untouchables. He did a great job with that.
Yeah, well, and that's another thing that I really, really sort of love about De Palma, David, is that he doesn't shy away from blatantly wearing his influences on his sleeves. And if he thinks a filmmaker did something that was cool, he's going to try it, but he's going to try it the Brian De Palma way.
Yeah, and he's gotten some flack for that, but he always said, I've always been very open about my influences. And when I spoke to him, he said, all the ground rules of suspense are in Hitchcock's work. And if you watch it, it's all there, And he actually gave me a very good to any screenwriters or budding filmmakers out there. I once asked him, he gave me a really good answer too about what do you think is one of the big keys to suspense? He gave me a very good 2-word answer: withholding information.
Mm.
So,
well, that's interesting too, because I kind of know that like Hitchcock's theory on thrillers was, what suspense, not surprise.
right.
And, the idea that either we know something the audience doesn't know or vice versa. So that's really interesting. And I'm glad you sort of passed that along, because it'll help understand the way that De Palma frames certain things in some of his more suspenseful movies. So let's go a little bit back to, those days where you kind of saw him on the Z channel and then rented Carrie. And then, like you said, Scarface was kind of a staple. Like, at what point did you become aware that like De Palma was doing something that was different enough for you to take notice of and sort of go along for the ride?
It's hard to pinpoint with him. There's other directors that I can remember it a little more clearly. When I became a big horror movie fan in the 80s, you saw a lot of crap like slasher films, but you would also go back to things like Sisters and things like that. Because I remembered my mother seeing that when it came out, and she could still remember how scary it was. And I don't know at what point I got into like Phantom of the Paradise and things like that. I probably did from the Danny Peary books, if you remember the books, Cult Movies.
Mm.
Because that one's in there. Quite a few De Palma films are in there because a lot of his early stuff are kind of cult films, and it's interesting because Phantom of the Paradise is now getting a bit of a revival with rock and roll guys. There's a guy named Justin Hawkins who's the
The
lead
Darkness,
singer
yeah.
of the band The Darkness, and he did a whole episode on YouTube. He had just discovered Phantom of the Paradise and loves it, and talked about, oh, the music on this is so great and blah blah blah. It's kind of like, where's this movie been all my life?
Yeah, and it's funny too, because it's like for years and years and years, people have rightfully talked about, how great the Rocky Horror Picture Show is. But Phantom of the Paradise was the rock and roll midnight movie before Rocky Horror.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because with some of the rock and roll films and many of the great ones like that one and Rocky Horror and Spinal Tap, those, for some reason, those always become cult films. They're not like big hits right away. But I think in the case of those 3 movies that I just mentioned, I think they were a little ahead of their time. I think Spinal Tap, it was right in there when heavy metal was becoming big again, but it was a little bit ahead of its time at the same time as well. And I think Phantom of the Paradise might have been, it was on time, but it was also a little bit ahead of its time, because it's interesting because it came in the time when the music business had exploded. And I think at that point, that was the first time the music business had made over $1 billion or something like that. And like bands were finally headlining stadiums and all of that. And Brian De Palma very clearly saw in the rock and roll world how over the top it is, and how it's all about like blow yourself up and do it again, do it more, that kind of thing. So he caught on to that right away. I'm not sure why it wasn't a hit at the time, but of course it's become a cult film, and now even today people are rediscovering it. I mean, that's an interesting thing too with De Palma, is he's had quite a few films like that keep getting rediscovered like that, even the ones that were hits, like Carrie. I mean, I think, the hell of high school is something that's always going to be with us. And if you show that to any high school kid that doesn't fit in or doesn't belong, they can relate to that film. Stuff like Scarface, that's been the theme of so many movies about, for what profit a man who gains the world and loses his soul and becomes so obsessed with power that he loses sight of everything else. I mean, I think these are universal themes that are always going to be with us.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And to sort of get back to, movies that are sort of ahead of their time, I think it is true that there are movies that it just takes a while for audiences to catch up. We famously had the summer of '82 where we had E.T., which was this huge commercial sort of phenomenon. But then that summer, we also got Blade Runner and The Thing, 2 movies that are very highly regarded now, that it took a really long time for people to, a lot of, the mainstream to get on board with. And I think the other thing about cult films, David, is a lot of times they initially appeal to the weirdos in the world. And I'm saying this as a weirdo. I'm a
Yeah.
self-professed, weirdo. I'm not ashamed to admit it. But I
Me
think a lot
too,
of times
absolutely.
weirdos get on the ground floor with lots of things that go on to be loved and respected.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure. And also, Tron in '82. It's hard to believe this. A lot of people don't realize that was a big flop when it
Mhm.
came out. Now it's a revered film from '82 as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing because I remembered reading. I think it was in Jerry Weintraub's book. He talked about the movie Cruising, which
Mhm.
was way too dark of a movie to ever become a hit. But he talked about how we were very ahead of our time with that film. And he said, we were ahead of our time. It wasn't a hit. He said, it's always better to be too late than too early.
Yeah, absolutely. Am I incorrect in thinking that at some point De Palma was potentially attached to that movie?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, that's something that could be up his alley, but I think Friedkin kind of developed that himself, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have
Yeah.
to look into that, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was up for it. I mean, a lot of dark, gritty New York films, I think he would be one of the first people you would have on a short list to do something like that. He may
Yeah.
have been, I'm not sure, but
Yeah, it's the one thing with doing this podcast, David, is I've read and watched a lot of De Palma stuff. So I'm not great at keeping track of where I've read things. And also, I'm sure that Freakin' was also probably offered things that De Palma ended up doing. So I did want to talk a little bit about, you had mentioned Carrie, and I want to sort of get your take on things because for me, I think De Palma's career can really be looked at sort of pre-Carrie and post-Carrie. And
right,
I was
yeah.
curious what your feelings were on the stuff he did prior to Carrie, because he did a lot of he did the Sisters, which we mentioned, but he did a lot of kind of small quirky comedies, and then after Carrie he kind of focused a little bit more, and I think it's almost like a phase one and phase two part of a career.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely took him to another level. And it's an interesting thing because, I've talked to people who worked on Carrie, and United Artists thought it was going to be their big movie that season. They actually thought that was going to be their big hit. And then this little movie called Rocky comes out of nowhere. Although Carrie did just fine. It did very well. I mean, De Palma felt they undersold it. He thought, well, horror films were always treated like, mentally challenged stepchildren or whatever the phrase was. But yeah, I think that was I guess it's kind of like when Roman Polanski did Rosemary's Baby. I think he said words to the effect of like, I've been waiting for Rosemary's Baby my entire career. And like this is like the perfect movie for me. I think, a lot of movies that become successful, it's kind of like a perfect storm where it's like you got the right director, the right material. First Stephen King adaptation, and De Palma was, the perfect guy to do that. And also, you had a young cast of a lot of people, that were on the verge of breaking out, like a lot of films in the '70s then. So again, it's one of those things where the elements really came together. Like you look at Silence of the Lambs. I mean, every element on that movie came together. That was absolutely a perfect storm, and good luck repeating that.
Yeah. Hey, well, and not to get, and I mean, I'm fine going down this road with you because you're an author that has written about horror films. But one thing that's always funny to me, David, is how everybody gave The Silence of the Lambs a pass. They
Yeah.
they fell over themselves to say it wasn't a horror movie.
Yeah. Well, that's and a lot of times they didn't use that term, kind of like when they were making Star Wars, and nobody dared say the term science fiction because that was death in those days. Nobody working on The Exorcist considered it a horror film. Nobody dared say the H word on that film,
Mhm.
and a lot of people were like, if it was pitched to us as a horror film, we wouldn't have done it. That
Yeah.
kind of thing. So I think a lot of the really great stuff kind of transcends the genre in a way. Like you look at Jaws. I mean, I consider it a horror film, but it's also action, there's comedy, drama. It encompasses a lot of things and kind of escapes genre. But yeah, I mean, it's like horror films have always been kind of considered like low rent or that kind of thing. But somebody who worked at United Artists said to me, it's really a movie about teen angst.
Hmm.
So I mean, you can look at it however you want to, but it is a horror film. I mean, make
Yeah.
no mistake.
So I've said on this show before that one of the biggest things I love about De Palma is his ability to sort of work and master multiple genres. Do you think the fact that Carrie wasn't branded for lack of a better word, a hardcore horror film, that it allowed De Palma to not get stuck making horror movies for the rest of his career?
Mm, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, one thing that I remembered reading, they did a really good oral history of Carrie in premieres written by a guy named Josh Rottenberg, who I think wrote for the LA Times for a while. He's done a lot of he's worked for a lot of different places. And if I remember correctly, because back in those days, everybody knew everybody, like De Palma and Lucas were friends. This is before everybody blew up and became huge. And American Graffiti had come out, and that was a big hit. And De Palma was like, that's not how I remember high school. I want to do something a little more like that. But I would think it could have very easily have trapped him in that genre. And in fact, The Fury was in a very similar vein to Carrie. He could have been stuck in that, and how he was able to move beyond that, I'm not sure. I mean, he's actually pretty good at comedy too. I mean, I haven't seen what was it, Wise Guys in forever. I liked it when I was a kid.
I watched it about 2 weeks ago, and it is a very good comedy.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, he's actually pretty adept at comedy as well. So yeah, I mean, he can do a lot of different stuff with his style. He even did, as we all know, a music video.
Yeah, Dancing in the Dark. Yeah.
Also, he kind of brought in the world of MTV a little bit in Body Double, where all of a sudden the movie becomes a music video with Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which was kind of an interesting little idea in there. So,
yeah, David, I have to say that in the past probably month and a half, Body Double has shot up really, really high on my list of favorite De Palma films.
yeah, I still can't get past the scene with the drill, though.
Oh, yeah. But
even by De Palma standards, that's pretty rough stuff. I have to say. If I read correctly, I think when it world premiered, I think that scene got booed.
Really?
Yeah, that was a big turd in the punch bowl with that one. But there's good stuff in it. And again, I thought it was really interesting how, and that was in '84 when MTV was really, really big. That was the peak of it. So that was kind of interesting how he took that. That was also when, porno was really big and everybody was renting it. So that was kind of an interesting little, how he was able to incorporate those two elements together. That was kind of an interesting experiment as well.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because, I for some reason I group Dress to Kill and Body Double sort of together. I guess because they're both, they both involve women being murdered. But for the longest time, I thought Dress to Kill was the superior movie. And they both have a very similar sequence where we're tracking a female protagonist. And I just think the sequence in Body Double is executed better.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, Dress to Kill is a really good movie too, and it's something that completely flew over my head until somebody pointed out to me is the Argento influence on that.
Yeah.
That was a big duh. Why didn't I see it? Like with the elevator scene about how that was kind of like him doing his take on Argento, which I didn't catch on to for a while.
Yeah, no, I mean there's definitely similarities you can see in their filmmaking styles. Overall, is there an opinion of where De Palma sort of ended up after, let's say, Femme Fatale? Do you think he got tired of sort of the Hollywood game, or did Hollywood get tired of Brian De Palma?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's like the last De Palma film that I really liked that I thought was really well done was Carlito's Way. Did Raising Cain come after that?
No, it was before.
Okay, and Raising Cain, it wasn't the greatest, but it was still fine and an enjoyable watch. I don't know. I mean, sometimes there just comes a point with a lot of directors where I guess they just don't have it anymore, or I don't know if they're tired or whatever. But I would like to think that even if I haven't liked anything he's done since Carlito's Way, he's still had a hell of a track record, in my opinion. I mean, I would say he's made at least 10 very, very good, very solid movies and some genuine masterpieces. And I think any director would kill for that, And it's all about your batting average because nobody's filmography is perfect. Everybody's going to have a bomb or a failure. That's always going to be.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I mean, the whole premise of this podcast is I consider De Palma the greatest American director. So you don't have to convince me. But I would say, yeah, that 10 number is pretty good out of what, almost 30 films.
Yeah.
And I think you keyed in on the fact that he's made multiple masterpieces. Most filmmakers are considered great if they have one masterpiece. And again, the thing that I really, really love and appreciate and sort of would argue for De Palma is that those masterpieces are in genres that are completely different from each other. I mean, Carlito's Way is a masterpiece. I would say it's one of the best films of the 90s. But then he also makes a movie like Blowout, which they're very, very two different, kinds of films.
Yeah, and in fact, I forget the woman's name, but there's a film buff on YouTube from Texas with brown hair. Her name escapes me right now, but she did a thing on Blowout. She actually considers it De Palma's masterpiece, and that's a film that I still think to this day hasn't totally gotten its due. And that's overdue to be rediscovered as well. And unfortunately, that was when Filmways was going out of business and all that. I'm not sure why it didn't connect, but Travolta said, I think he said in his Playboy interview or something like that, he ran into Barry Diller, who ran Paramount, and he said if we released that movie, it would have been a hit.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and I mean, historically, I would say that had Travolta not done Blowout, he wouldn't have been in Pulp Fiction, and then his career would have been very, very different.
Yeah, I think from what I remembered hearing or reading, I think that was a big reason why he cast him was because of his role in Blowout. And it's funny because, Sue Mengers, the famous talent agent, said, "Oh, Pulp Fiction was great. I mean, who would have thought to hire John Travolta playing a punk killer?" Well, De Palma did. I mean, not like he hired him to play a punk and Carrie, and he killed the pig. But I mean, it's like he's done this kind of, even though he has that real big screen charisma and that huge smile and those big blue eyes. I mean, he can play bad characters too, so it wasn't totally without precedent.
Yeah, and it just took a filmmaker like I think Quentin Tarantino to be like, I don't care where this guy's career is now, he's good for the role. And I mean, something similar happened with Robert Forster for Jackie Brown.
Yes.
Or even you could even say Pam Grier. I mean, just because an actor isn't, sort of in favor right now doesn't mean that they're still not the best person for the role.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think Travolta had enough goodwill with audiences and fans that when he was finally in the right movie again, they were there. I mean, I know we're veering off topic a little bit. I'm a huge John Belushi fan, and I was of the opinion that, I mean, I was a little kid when he died, and I was still a huge fan of his, but and what do I know? But I was of the opinion that if he was in another big, funny comedy again, I think the audience would have been there for him. I mean, we hadn't given up on him yet. We were just waiting for him to be in another funny movie again,
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually done a lot of John Belushi watching in the last 6 months. I've read a couple of books, and it's interesting to think where his career would have gone, because it seemed like he was sort of venturing away from comedy a little bit, but I'd imagine that you have to take those journeys away from your bread and butter, before you can come back and sort of appreciate and excel what you did. I'm of the opinion, David, that there's going to be a time and a place. I don't know when it's going to be, but we're going to get a complete reassessment of Dan Aykroyd and how profound of a talent he was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, Howard Stern thought he was a genius comedian. I mean, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the hard thing, too, is it's hard to, it's very easy to get pigeonholed into things. And I think this is where De Palma got very lucky, was he was able to, branch out and show to Hollywood he could do big blockbuster movies. Although, again, like Carrie did fine. It made a lot of money, but he showed that, he could do stuff like The Untouchables and Mission Impossible. A lot of times when you have a hit movie, everyone just wants more of the same, and it's hard to break out of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely interesting to see how he was able to sort of, play in different worlds. So, David, I want to make sure that we leave enough time to talk about your books. And I think this was a great discussion about De Palma, and I would love to continue talking with you about De Palma. Absolutely. And maybe in the future we can have another extended discussion. But I do know that you have a couple of books out there. Do you want to talk a little bit about Real Terror?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I believe maybe not an entire chapter, but I do have a chapter on Carrie, and De Palma's in the book quite a bit. Obviously, I wrote a book called Real Terror, came out 2012, St. Martin's Press, and it's a history of the modern horror film. And De Palma is in there along with John Carpenter, Toby Hooper, round up the usual suspects for movies,
Mhm.
everything from, Nosferatu up to, I think I touched on torture porn briefly, and that's probably all it deserves. But, like that, George Romero, all that stuff. And there's a whole thing in there with Carrie where, I did rely quite a bit on the premiere article on Carrie, but I also found people who worked on it and had good stories to tell and all of that. And one of my favorite stories that was in the Josh Rottenberg article that I included in the book was about how George Lucas thought the ending of Carrie was brilliant because, we didn't have the multiplexes in those days. So everyone's waiting outside for this movie to let out, and all of a sudden the audience screams, and then the movie lets out. So someone's like, what's coming at the end of this movie that we have to be on guard for?
Oh, yeah. And it's funny. I did a previous episode on Carrie, and we talked about how like that ending. I mean, it was pretty much wholesale ripped off for the jump scare at the end of Friday the 13th, and has sort of become a staple of horror films.
Well, and then the funny thing is that was also inspired by Deliverance,
Yeah.
with the hand coming out of the river. And the story went that De Palma went to go see Deliverance, and walking, I said, I can do that so much better.
Yeah.
So, and Stephen King told the story. I think it was in Fangoria. He went to a preview of Carrie, where it's playing on a double bill with Norman. Is That You? The Red Fox comedy.
Hmm.
Did you know that movie?
Just by name.
Yeah, it's a comedy where Red Fox has to come to terms with his son being gay or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's directed by George Schlatter. So it was playing on a double bill with that. And I remember Stephen King said that there were these two big African American guys sitting right in front of him you'd think would be scared of nothing. And then, the hand comes out of the grave and they both grab each other. Oh my God. But I said, she ain't never gonna be right. She ain't never gonna be right, meaning the Amy Irving character.
Yeah. So, Real Terror, basically, you break down the history of horror over the last 100 years. And then you also wrote a book, Bang Your Head, right? About
Yeah,
heavy
it's about
metal.
heavy metal bands. Yes. There's nothing in there about Phantom of the Paradise, but there is a section on Spinal Tap, which is crucial to the history of heavy metal, whether heavy metal musicians want to acknowledge that or not. But
Yeah. No, I'm a big metal fan. And actually, a lot of my offline discussions with DX have revolved around music and heavier music. I'll include links where people can find out more about you, David, and your
well, thank
books.
you.
And I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to have this discussion. And I think it's going to be a really, really great episode because in previous episodes, we've kind of focused on, very scene specific moments in his filmography. And I think it was great to sort of talk about De Palma's career overall.
And one last thing I can mention, and this is something I was thinking about as well. There's a lot of things that have popped up with me when I've watched his work, like in Carrie, like The Bucket of Blood. I don't know if you've ever thought this, but that's the bomb theory that how Hitchcock came up with, except it was up in the rafters instead of under the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't realize that, but it's like, oh, that's what this is. But an interesting thing about Scarface as well, because Oliver Stone wrote the screenplay, and it's very much an Oliver Stone story, even though it's a remake of a classic 30s film, but it's very much his theme of the American dream really being the American nightmare. But it also, there's a big De Palma theme in it, and it didn't dawn on me. But, a big theme in De Palma's work is no good deed goes unpunished.
Right.
And that's how Tony Montana dies. He does the right. And I remember
Yeah.
asking Oliver Stone about that in creative screenwriting. I said, he does all these horrible things. Nothing bad happens to him. But when he tries to do the right thing, that's what ends up getting him killed. And I said, was that intentional? I said, yeah, it was.
That's excellent. I'm a big fan of Oliver Stone's work, and I think his work from the mid '80s to the mid '90s does not get the credit it deserves for how it altered the way people shot film. I mean, his use of different stocks and different media, it's really underappreciated now, and it's a shame that people don't respect the filmmaker that Oliver Stone was for a
Yeah, no,
period of
I
years.
agree. I think it's because he's just so over the top and so nuts and everything like that. But there is a real filmmaker there and a very good screenwriter working there as well. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I think it's like what Lawrence Grabell once said when he interviewed Oliver Stone for either Playboy or Movie Line or something like that. Love him or hate him, you can't ignore him.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I think the same thing could be said for De Palma. David, this was such an excellent discussion. I had a blast. And again, I look forward to hopefully speaking to you again. And
Yeah, well, now that we have the technical problems, we'll just go through Gmail from here on out, and we're good to go anytime.
absolutely. Thanks again.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.